Star Wars 7x7, episode 2315. Well, after sitting on The Mandalorian's season premiere for a couple of days, I'm having second thoughts about it, and I don't know if you are either. You know, it was certainly enjoyable, to be sure, but I'm considering questions about nostalgia and fan service and the subject I'm going to talk about today, which has to do with the originality of the story presented to us. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So I find this episode and possibly the next couple to be a little bit difficult because I like to stay focused on the positive, and so I'm going to start off by staying focused on the positive and say I enjoyed the episode, I really did, and I think there were a lot of positive things about it. For example, they kind of kept Baby Yoda on the down low, like they did not make it the Baby Yoda show, it is still the Mandalorian show, and even though this was very much sort of an adventure of the week kind of episode, they did a good job in tying it to a broader story arc. This idea that the Mandalorian is trying to reconnect Baby Yoda with his kind, and this is how he's going to do it, and this particular episode is a stepping stone on that journey. One of the things that's been circling around in my head, though, over the past few days that I just can't quite resolve is the question of why did it have to be Tatooine? And I know why it could have been and was, and we'll get to that momentarily, but in fact, actually, let's just get to it right now. So the reason why is because there's a loop to be closed, and that has to do with the fact that Mandalorian armor exists on Tatooine. It was worn by Boba Fett. We know from other stories that it was taken by a guy named Cobb Vanth, who we meet in this episode. And so, yes, it is addressing a storyline that in the canon chronology is 5 or 6 years old. In the timeline that you and I are living in, it's a 37-year-old story with an update given to it about 5 years ago through the Aftermath novels by Chuck Wendig. But that didn't have to be the case, right? It could have been any other planet. It could have been any other person in any other set of Mandalorian armor, right? And it still would have been the same story, and it still would have been a satisfying story just by itself, right? If the Mandalorian showed up on some random planet and there was a guy who had taken on some Mandalorian armor but wasn't himself or herself a Mandalorian, and they faced each other down, and then there was a bigger threat that the Mandalorian decided to help this faux Mandalorian, if you will, defeat and make the barter arrangement for, if you help me beat this crazy giant thing, then I'll give you the armor, right? That storyline would have worked just fine for this episode. It didn't have to be. That's so hysterical. I was actually going to pronounce Tatooine and then I extended it to the have. It didn't have to be Tatooine, and it didn't have to be Boba Fett's armor. And as much of a fan as I am of the original trilogy, and as much as I've wondered about the fate of Boba Fett, especially after it was brought up again in the Aftermath novels and it's still been this open question, yes, I'm excited that that chapter has been closing, and yet I wonder whether it would have been better for The Mandalorian to be looking forward with its storytelling and not looking backward to close these sort of loops. Star Wars as a franchise has a reputation for closing loops like this and filling in details on backstories of characters and planets and that sort of thing. So, you know, that is kind of its reflexive posture basically, but the species of Yoda and Yaddle, and now of Baby Yoda, is one of the few places where there has been actual mystery, where there's been something unsolved in the realm of Star Wars. And I feel like it would be nice to have more of those elements, more places where you and I can fill in the details ourselves, and we can bring in our own wonder and our own imagination to these stories. The fact that they seem to feel like there's a necessity to fill that story makes me a little nervous. I still want Baby Yoda's species to be utterly mysterious. I hope that we don't learn that there is some databank somewhere that, you know, maybe Luke Skywalker discovered in a Jedi temple that's going to tell us all about him. No, I still want that to be a mystery. And I think the presence and necessity of mystery is one that is kind of unappreciated, not just in Star Wars, but in storytelling in general these days. Now, before I wrap up, I do just want to give a brief public service announcement, if I may, since today is Election Day in the United States, and as I'm recording this, the polls are still open all across the country. It's still early where we are here, and yet we may not know the results on election night. There are lots of mail-in ballots to count, lots of absentee ballots that are still coming in, and even as I mentioned last night, stuff coming from overseas from the military may take another week to tabulate. And maybe it'll be a landslide one way or the other, maybe it'll be really close, don't know. Just please keep in mind that the results as you see them on the day this podcast drops, November 4th, maybe we are not official just yet, so take some time to relax, take some time to breathe, take a step or two away from news cycles and social media if you need to get your heartbeat under control. I've talked to a lot of people who have been very stressed and on pins and needles over the past couple of days, waiting to see how this whole thing turns out. But the best thing you can do for yourself, which means that it's also good for your loved ones as well, is to take a step back, to breathe, to find your calm, and to understand that this process will be worked out and that there are a lot of people working to ensure that it works out freely and fairly. Even as there are bad actors out there, there are still many more who are working for the good of the country. All right, so with this whole notion of whether they should have gone back to Tatooine and whether they needed to fill this particular story in or whether they could have just invented their own story, I want to know what you think. Is this something that you feel like should have been more of original story, original characters, or do you like the fact that they went back and closed this particular story loop? Not necessarily the fact that, oh my gosh, it was Boba Fett's armor, just the notion of whether you liked that they were closing a loop that had been left open for a while. Let me know wherever you find comments for this post, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube or at homebase at sw7x7.com. I would really appreciate it. I would love to hear what you think. And that is going to do it for today's episode of the show. Thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2020 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.